Welcome to Brand of Outlaws, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Narrated by Richard Pulsifer. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. After an early breakfast, I took a stroll up and down the main street of Sanderson, gathering information and making observations that could come in handy later. I returned to the hotel, ready for whatever the day had in store. As I approached, I noticed a stagecoach already packed with passengers, but it wasn't heading to Linrock. However, I had discovered that another stage left for that destination 3 times a week. I spotted several cowboy broncos tied to a railing, and a bit further down the road, 2 buckboards with horses that caught my attention. These had to be the teams that Colonel Barkley had mentioned to Reuben Darling. Just then, both men emerged from the hotel, and Darling noticed me. He signaled Barkley before walking over to me. "Are you Tim the cowboy?" he asked. I nodded and sized him up. In the daylight, he was just as impressive as he had been in the evening, but the light didn't do much for his dark complexion. "Here's your pay," he said, handing me some bills. "Miss Barkley doesn't need your services at the ranch anymore." "What do you mean? This is the first I'm hearing of it," I replied. "Sorry, kid, that's all there is to it," he said, cutting me off. "She gave me the money and told me to pay you off. You don't need to speak to her about it." In other words, he was saying that even a goodbye with Miss Barkley was not desirable. As luck would have it, the girls appeared at that moment, and I went straight to them. I was relieved that Reuben Darling couldn't help but notice the warm welcome I received from Miss Barkley. Her smile and "Good morning, Tim" showed no sign that I was not to continue serving her indefinitely. As I had expected, she had no idea that Darling had fired me on her behalf. "Miss Barkley," I said, dismayed, "what have I done?" "Why'd you let me go?" She looked shocked. "Tim, I don't get it." "Why'd you fire me?" I pressed on, trying to look devastated. "I haven't even had a chance yet. I really wanted to work for you, Miss Gwen. What did I do wrong? Why'd you let me go?" "I didn't," Miss Barkley stated firmly, her dark eyes sparkling. "But hold on, here's my pay," I continued, showing her the money. "Mr. Darling just came up to me and said you sent this over, that you wouldn't need me at the ranch anymore." Miss Gwen let out a little gasp. She seemed taken aback by what she had heard. "My cousin Reuben said that?" she asked me. I nodded my head vigorously. At that moment, Darling walked up to us, practically shoving me aside. "Come on, ladies, let's take a walk before we leave," he said cheerfully. "I'll show you Sanderson." "Wait, please," Miss Barkley interjected, looking directly at him. "Cousin Reuben, I think there's a mistake, maybe a misunderstanding. This is the cowboy I hired, Mr. Tim. He says you gave him money and told him I fired him." "Yes, cousin, I did," he retorted, his voice getting louder. A hint of red crept up his cheeks. "We don't need him at the ranch. We have plenty of other boys. I just wanted to let him down easy and not bother you." It was clear that Reuben Darling had made a grave error. First, Miss Barkley was utterly bewildered, then disappointed, and finally she lifted her head with a sort of haughty elegance. She would have addressed him directly, but Colonel Barkley approached us. "Dad, did you tell Reuben to fire Tim?" she asked him. "I definitely did not," the colonel replied with a chuckle. "Reuben acted on his own." "Is that so? I'd like my cousin to understand that I'm my own boss. I've always taken care of my own affairs, and I'll keep doing so. Tim, I'm sorry you've been treated this way." "Listen up, from now on you take orders from me," Colonel Barkley barked at me. "So does that mean I'm going to Linrock with you?" I asked. "Of course, ride with Gwen and me today," he replied. As they walked away, I noticed Darling's discomfort. Colonel Barkley seemed to relish it. "Diane's just like her mother," he said to Reuben. "You've made a terrible first impression." Darling's temper flared up, and I could tell he was a dangerous man. "Tim, let me tell you," he said, leaning in close to me. "Don't go to Linrock." "Hey, Mr. Darling," I blustered, trying to sound tough. "If you threaten me, I'll have you thrown in jail." Both men were taken aback by my response. Darling was at a loss for words. "Are you really going to Linrock?" he asked, his voice thick with anger. I looked at him differently than I had before. "You bet I am. I replied with a caustic tone. Colonel Barkley intervened, grabbing Darling's arm. They both looked at me with interest. I walked away, not bothering to listen to their conversation. "Reuben, your temper will get you in trouble one day," Colonel Barkley warned. "You'll mess with the wrong guy eventually. Look, here come Joe and Brick." I turned my attention to the two cowboys. One had fiery red hair and the other had a bold demeanor. They were the type of cowboys the Rangers called four flushes, hard-drinking, devil-may-care types who packed guns and were always looking for trouble. Although the Rangers had a high standard for bravery, cowboys like these could still be dangerous to ordinary men. The smaller of the two was Joe, and when Darling spoke to him, he turned to look at me, his thin mouth slanting down in a menacing way. Brick gave me a once-over, and I could tell he wasn't a seasoned cowboy. Right off the bat, I had three adversaries, Darling and his crew. But honestly, I would have butted heads with them no matter what. I had a feeling that we were on the verge of a confrontation, but Miss Barkley interrupted my thoughts by calling out to me. "Get our bags, Tim," she said. I quickly grabbed them and saw that Darling and his posse had already saddled up. Colonel Barkley was in the lead buckboard with two unfamiliar men, while the girls rode in the second one. The driver of the second buckboard was a tall, skinny teenager who looked like he was still growing. We were all cramped for space, but that wasn't going to ruin the ride for me. We followed the leaders through the town's main street and out onto a well-worn road that stretched northwest. To our left were the bleak mountains I had noticed yesterday, and to our right was a flat, mesquite-covered expanse. The driver urged his horses into a fast trot, and we kept close to Colonel Barkley, who was having an intense conversation with his companions. The girls behind me were losing interest in the ride as we approached our destination of Linrock. They chatted about what the town might be like, while I occasionally asked the driver some questions. Unfortunately, the ride wasn't as exciting as it was yesterday. Every half-mile or so we passed a ranch house, and as we got further out from Sanderson, the ranches became few and far between. Eventually, they were so spread out that each one stood alone in the vast wilderness. As we rode along, we came across a stream that flowed north. I was surprised to see the amount of water it carried. It must have come from the mountains far west. The sandy ground was covered in tufts of grass, but it was so high and thick that it could easily graze 1,000,000 head of stock, considering the immense area in sight. In the forenoon, we made 3 stops. The first was at a suitable place to water the horses, the second was at a chuck wagon belonging to cowboys who were out riding after stock, and the third was at a small cluster of adobe and stone houses constituting a hamlet the driver called Barkley, named after the colonel. From that point on to Linrock, there were only a few ranches, each one controlling great acreage. Early in the afternoon, we sighted Linrock from a ridgetop. It was a green path amidst the mass of gray. For the barrens of Texas, it was indeed a fair sight, but I was more concerned about its remoteness from civilization than its beauty. In the early 1870s, when the vast western third of Texas was a wilderness, the pioneer had done wonders to settle there and establish places like Linrock. As we rolled swiftly along, the whole sweeping range was dotted with cattle, and farther on, within a few miles of town, there were droves of horses that brought enthusiastic praise from Miss Barkley and her cousin. "There's plenty of room here for long rides," I said, waving my hand at the gray-green expanse. "Your horses won't suffer on this range." She was delighted, and her cousin, for once, seemed speechless. "That's the ranch," said the driver, pointing with his whip. It only took a glance for me to see that Colonel Barkley's ranch was on a scale fitting the country. The house was situated on the only elevation around Linrock, and it was not high, nor more than a few minutes' walk from the edge of town. The structure before us was a sprawling, flat-roofed building made of red adobe bricks that seemed to cover an entire acre of land. Everything was lush and green, except for the corrals and barns that were fenced off and painted in shades of gray and red. As we approached, Darling and the cowboys vanished into the cottonwood trees, leaving Colonel Barkley waiting for us beside the buckboard. His expression was the best I had seen on him thus far, radiating warmth, love, and a hint of melancholy. His daughter was equally agitated, and I quickly offered my seat to the colonel, sensing that this was not the time for me to be in the spotlight. I took advantage of the situation and turned towards the town, walking leisurely through the shady outskirts of Linrock. My feelings were a mix of curiosity, eagerness, and anticipation as I strolled down a side street, passing small red houses nestled among oak and cottonwood trees. I walked all the way to the other end of the street, crossing several intersections, encountering children, well-dressed women, and dusty-booted men. I turned right at a right angle and headed up several blocks until I reached a tree-lined plaza. On the other side of the plaza was a broad street that, despite the number of horses and people, had a sleepy air about it. I remained alert, taking in everything around me, wondering if I would run into Foster and how I would recognize him. But I felt confident that I could spot the ranger out of 1,000 strangers, even though we had never met. As I continued walking, the residences gave way to buildings that fronted right onto the stone sidewalk. I passed a grain store, a hardware store, and a grocery store, and then several empty buildings and a vacant corner. The following block, apart from the rough exteriors of the crude structures, would have been considered a small town in eastern Texas. Evidence of business consistent with a prosperous community of 2,000 inhabitants was visible. On both sides of the street, the next block was a solid row of saloons, resorts, and hotels. There were saddled horses hitched along the sidewalk in 2 long lines, with a buckboard and team here and there breaking the continuity. This block was bustling and noisy. From all appearances, Linrock was like any other frontier town, and my expectations were barely met. As the afternoon was coming to a close, I retraced my steps and went back to the ranch. The driver boy, whom I had heard called Dick, was looking for me, apparently at Miss Barkleys' request, and he led me to the house. It was even more massive than I had imagined from a distance, and the adobe bricks were worn smooth by rain and wind. As we walked by, I got a glimpse in at several doors. There was comfort here that spoke volumes about the many freighters' trips from Del Rio. I was pleased to see things that were little short of luxurious for that part of the country, for the sake of the young ladies. At the far end of the house, Dick took me to a small room that was very satisfactory to me. I asked about bunkhouses for the cowboys, and he said they were full to overflowing. "Colonel Barkley has a big outfit, huh?" "I reckon he does," replied Dick. "I don't know how many cowboys there are. They're always coming and going. I'm not acquainted with half of them." "Is there a lot of stock movement these days?" "Stock's always moving," he replied with a strange look. "Rustlers." But he didn't follow up with the affirmative I expected. "Linrock is a lively place, I hear." "It's not as lively as Sanderson, but it's bigger." "Yes, I heard it was." I overheard a conversation about 2 cowboys who were recently arrested. I asked about it and was told that they were Joe Bean and Brick Higgins, who belonged to the ranch but were not often around. Not wanting to seem too curious, I changed the subject. It turned out that Miss Barkley, whom I was working for, had not left any instructions for me, so I had supper with Dick in the kitchen. He told me that the cowboys cooked their own meals at their bunks and assumed that I would eat at the ranch house. After supper, I explored the ranch and was impressed with the horses and the overall beauty of the place. I saw Miss Barkley and her cousin approaching with their dog, but avoided them. As the sun set, I headed into town to find Foster, but I had to be discreet about it. I walked up and down the main street until it got dark, then went into a hotel, and later a rough-looking establishment that was surprisingly nice inside. The place was crowded with dusty cowboys, and I listened to their conversations while I sat and watched. I eventually found a saloon where most of the patrons had been or were going, and it was a large room with a bar and many tables and chairs. This had to be the gambling establishment mentioned in the ranger's letter to Captain Neal and the one rumored to be owned by the Linrock mayor. It was the only sizable gambling spot in southern Texas where I'd observed the absence of Mexicans. There was some card-playing happening when I arrived. I lingered for a bit, aware that strangers were too common in Linrock to draw attention. However, I couldn't spot anyone who resembled Foster. I left feeling a little defeated. It had always been a point of pride for me that I couldn't spend an hour in an unfamiliar town or walk down a dimly lit street without experiencing something out of the ordinary. Some people called it luck, but I knew it was because I was always on the lookout for adventure. Nevertheless, on my first day and night in Linrock, despite my watchfulness and curiosity, it seemed that I was in for a disappointment. I was thinking this when I arrived at the last lit-up place on the block, a shabby little restaurant. Just then a tall, dark figure passed by me and disappeared into the darkness. There was a man sitting on the low steps and another standing in the doorway. "That was the guy everyone in town is talking about, the ranger," said one man. I froze in the shadows where I couldn't be seen. "Really? Is he staying here?" asked the other. "Yep," answered the man called Jim, emitting a humorless laugh. "He's been all my business lately, and he's offered to rent my old adobe house just outside town, you know, where I used to live before moving here. He's coming to look at it tomorrow." "Good Lord, does he expect to stay?" "Seems so. He's a real tough guy, that one. He's calm and collected, but there's something about him that just screams danger," said Jim. "Ah, Jim, he can't hang around here. He's just looking for someone," replied the other man. "I don't know what his plan is, but he's been here for a while and he's made an impression on me. Just now he asked me where Barkley lives. I asked him if he was going to pay a visit to our mayor, and he said yes. So I gave him directions to the ranch and he headed out that way," explained Jim. "The hell he did!" exclaimed the other man. I gathered from the man's reaction that he was both amazed and amused. Then the two men went into the restaurant, and I decided to introduce myself to the owner. The most important thing was that I had found Foster. I hurried ahead, thinking he had walked quickly. I reached the plaza, crossed it, and then wasn't sure which direction to take. But I didn't think it mattered, so I just hurried on, hoping to reach the ranch before Foster did. I wasn't sure if I had succeeded, but the moon was bright and I could hear a cowboy singing in the distance. There wasn't a soul in sight on the porch or in the courtyard. I didn't know what the inside of the house looked like, but when I peeked in the first window, I saw a large room where Miss Barkley and Gwen were sitting alone. It was a cozy room with white walls, a fireplace, and a big table with books and papers on it. Slowly backing away, I noticed that the room had a door leading out to the porch and two more windows. I listened, hoping to hear Foster's footsteps making their way up the road, but all I heard was Gwen's laughter and her cousin's soothing voice. Then in the distance I spotted some lit windows at the other end of the front part of the house. I made my way down there and found an open door. Through it I saw a room that looked exactly like the one I had just left. Inside were Colonel Barkley, Darling, and a few other men, all of them smoking and chatting. It might have been interesting to stick around and listen, but I had to get back to the road to catch Foster. I quickly retraced my steps and sat down on the porch steps. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw a very tall, dark figure approaching in the moonlit road. It was Foster! I wanted to shout out in excitement like a little boy. He came towards me slowly, looking all around, and then stopped about 20 paces away. He surveyed the house and then, spotting me, started coming forward again. At first I was struck by how big he was, but then I noticed that his face was hidden in the shadow of his sombrero. I had planned to reveal my identity as soon as I saw him, but I hesitated. He was affecting me in a strange way, or maybe it was just the realization that we rangers, who had so much in common and so much at stake, had finally come face to face. "Is Barkley at home?" he asked abruptly. "Yes," I replied. "Ask him if he'll see Vaughn Foster, Ranger." "Wait here," I said. I didn't want to waste any time explaining why I was there. I made a deliberate show of striding down the porch and entering the room where the men were smoking. I walked farther than I needed to just to announce my errand. I wanted to see Barkley's face, to look into his eyes. When I entered, the talking stopped, and I saw nothing but his face, which looked blank. "Vaughn Foster, Ranger, come to see you, sir," I said. Did Barkley flinch or show any sign of surprise when I made my announcement? It was hard to say for sure, but there was definitely a change in him. Darling, on the other hand, let out a sharp breath that sounded more like certainty than surprise. Barkley motioned for silence, and I knew he was in charge. "Did Foster say why he wanted to see me?" Barkley asked me. "No, sir," I replied. "Tell him I'm not home, Tim," Barkley ordered as he relit his pipe. As I left the room, I could feel the gears in my mind starting to turn. I knew there was more to this than Barkley was letting on. "Mr. Foster," I said as I approached him, "Colonel Barkley says he's not at home. You can tell your business to his daughter." Without waiting for a response, I knocked on the parlor door. Miss Barkley answered, dressed in white and looking as lovely as ever. "Miss Barkley, here is Vaughn Foster to see you," I said. "Please come in," she said graciously. Foster had to duck his head to enter the room. He was an imposing figure with a stern, chiseled face and piercing eyes. He wore a gray flannel shirt, corduroys, and a big gun on his hip. I followed him into the room, feeling like an intruder. Miss Barkley didn't seem to mind, though. She was a gracious hostess, and I couldn't help but wonder if Foster's well-known indifference to women would be put to the test in her presence. I had never seen a Texan as impressive as him before. It wasn't just his towering height or striking features that caught my attention, but something deeper, more spiritual. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Foster," said Miss Barkley, introducing us to her cousin Gwen Langdon. "We just arrived. I'm here to make this my home, and she's visiting me." Foster greeted Gwen with a smile and a bow. He was at ease with a rough sort of grace and didn't seem fazed by the presence of two beautiful women. "We've heard of you in Austin," said Gwen, her eyes misbehaving. I hoped I wouldn't have to be jealous of Foster, but this girl seemed like a bit of a flirt. "I didn't expect to be received by ladies," replied Foster. "I came to see Mr. Barkley, but he wouldn't see me. He told me to tell my business to his daughter. I'm glad to know you both, but sorry you've come to Linrock. It's pretty rough around here, not a place for girls to walk and ride." "Why's that?" asked both girls in unison. "Because it's a rough place, and my business has to do with rough characters," said Foster. "You're ranger duty, right?" asked Miss Barkley. "That's part of it," said Foster. "But my job is to make Linrock a better place." "That's a splendid and worthy task," said Miss Barkley warmly. "I wish you success." "Mr. Foster, are you saying that Linrock is truly as wicked as you claim?" I asked, my tone incredulous. "I'm afraid so," he replied firmly. I could see the doubt in Miss Barkley's eyes as she asked, "And my father refused to see you? Did he not want to cooperate?" "That's correct," Foster confirmed. "Please, Mr. Foster, tell me what is happening in Linrock and what it is that you are supposed to do," she implored, her expression serious. "I know my father considers himself the law there. Perhaps he doesn't want any interference, but I also know he won't tolerate any opposition. Please tell me, I may be able to help." As Foster spoke about Linrock, I noticed the intense interest on Miss Barkley's face. She and Gwen both listened intently to Foster's every word, captivated by his storytelling ability. He spoke convincingly, with a certain persuasive power that betrayed his experience, and his face, once stern and hard, softened as he conveyed his noble intentions, something quite unexpected in a gun-fighting ranger. "Papa said you were a hunter of outlaws, a man who'd rather kill than save," she exclaimed, shocked. Foster's face hardened once more. "My name is infamous, I'm sorry to say," he admitted. "Have you killed men?" she asked, her eyes widening. I could sense the tension in the air as Foster's face became a mask. He didn't answer, but I knew the truth. "Miss Barkley, I hope I won't have to," he said quietly. His words seemed to calm her, but I knew that the situation in Linrock was far from over. I had correctly assessed her character, young, inexperienced, but full of pride, passion, and fire. She was beautiful then, with her fair complexion. Foster was watching her, and he couldn't have missed the radiance of her beauty or the display of her quick and noble heart. "Excuse me, Mr. Foster," she said, regaining her composure. "I apologize for my curiosity. Thank you for trusting me. Your news is distressing, but I enjoyed our conversation. You can count on me to talk to my father." It seemed like a dismissal, so the ranger left. I followed without saying anything. When we reached the end of the porch and walked into the moonlight, I decided not to reveal my identity. I don't know why, but I wanted to surprise him and earn his approval. He towered over me, appearing not to notice my presence. This ranger was a strange, distant man. However, I remembered how earnestly he spoke to Miss Barkley, so I couldn't think of him as cold. But I must have thought he was immune to the charms of those lovely girls. Suddenly, as we walked under the shade of the cottonwood trees, he clapped his big hand on my shoulder. "My God, Tim, she's gorgeous," he exclaimed. Despite my shock, I hugged him. He recognized me. "I thought you didn't swear," I gasped. Those were my first words to Vaughn Foster, and they sounded ridiculous. "My boy, I saw you looking for me up and down the street," he said. "I was going to help you find me tomorrow." We shook hands, and the firm grip meant a lot. "Yes, she's beautiful, Foster," I said. "But did you see the cousin, the little girl with the bright eyes?" Then we laughed and let go of each other's hands. "Let's go somewhere," I suggested. "I've got a lot to tell you," I said as we made our way out into the open. The moonlight shone down on us, illuminating the white stones that dotted the landscape. We sat down in the sand, our backs against a rest, and began our conversation. I started by recounting Neil's urgent message to me, then told him about my trip to the capital and what I had overheard in the adjutant's office. I went on to describe my interview with the officials and the spying on Colonel Barkley. I told him about Neil's directions, advice, and command, and about our ride towards San Antonio. I mentioned how I had been hired as a cowboy by Miss Barkley and the further ride on to Sanderson, along with the incident that occurred there. Finally, I told him about how I had approached Barkley and thought it wise to involve his daughter in our plan. The conversation was long, even for me, and my voice sounded hoarse by the end. "I told Neil I'd be lucky to get you," Foster said after a moment of silence. It was the only comment he made about my actions, the only praise I received. But the way he said it so calmly and quietly made me feel unworthy of such recognition. "Oh, I almost forgot," I said, relieved to be rid of the large bundle of bills I had been carrying. Foster looked surprised, but he was pleased. "The captain loves the service," he said. "He alone understands the value of the Rangers. And the work he's devoted his life to, the good that service can do, all depends on you and me, Tim." I nodded, feeling gloomy. Foster paused for a moment, lost in thought. The moon was high in the sky, and a cool wind rustled the greasewood. A dog barked in the distance, and lights twinkled in the town below. I looked back up at the dark hill and thought of Gwen Langdon. Meeting Foster and coming to Linrock had not changed my feelings for her, but it seemed as if I was now lost in thought, out of reach. "Well, son, listen," Foster began. "He might even be in cahoots with the gang, but I hope not." Foster chuckled. "You're a smart one, Tim. You've got it all figured out. Now let's get to work." I nodded, feeling the weight of the task ahead of me. Foster had given me a plan, but it was a dirty one. I had to pretend to be someone I wasn't, all while keeping up appearances with Miss Barkley. It didn't sit right with me, but I knew it was necessary for the job. As I left Foster's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Barkley. I didn't know what it was, but I was determined to find out. This was my chance to prove myself as a ranger, and I wasn't going to let anyone down. I spent the next few days ingratiating myself with the gang. I played cards, drank whiskey, and laughed at their jokes. It wasn't easy, but I was making progress. They were starting to trust me, and I was learning more about their operations. At night, Foster and I would meet up and discuss our findings. It was grueling work, but we were making headway. We were getting closer to the truth about Barkley and his connections to the gang. But as the days went on, I found myself growing more and more attached to Miss Barkley. She was everything Foster had said she was and more. Kind, intelligent, and beautiful. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, but I couldn't help the way I felt. As the investigation continued, I found myself torn between my duty to the Rangers and my feelings for Miss Barkley. It was a difficult balancing act, but I knew I had to stay focused. The fate of the town depended on it. And so I continued to play my role, pretending to be someone I wasn't. But deep down I knew that the truth would eventually come out, and when it did, I would have to face the consequences of my actions. But for now, all I could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. "I don't like him, but I hope we're wrong for his daughter's sake," Foster said, his eyes deep and gleaming in the moonlight as he searched my face. "You sure you're not going to fall in love with her, son?" "I'm positive. Why?" I asked. "Because if you did, I'd likely have need of a new man in your place," he replied. I pressed him for more information about Barkley, but he claimed to know no more than I did. "When a fellow has been years at this game, he has a sixth sense. Mine seldom fails me," Foster said. "I never yet faced the criminal who didn't somehow betray fear. Not so much fear of me, but fear of himself, his life, his deeds. That's conscience, or if not, just realization of fate." I wondered if that was the same fear I had seen in Barkley's face. "I'm sorry Diane Barkley came out here," I said. Foster didn't say whether he shared that feeling or not. He was looking out at the moon-blanched level, and something in his face made me think he was thinking about the beautiful girl who might be brought to disgrace and unhappiness. Chapter 2. As I sat atop the corral fence, taking in the breathtaking view before me, I couldn't help but feel grateful for still being in the employ of Diane Barkley. A whole month had flown by, filled with new experiences and a sense of renewed life. It was a beautiful morning in May, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon. The dew on the leaves and grass shimmered like diamonds in the early light, and the gentle breeze carried the sweet melody of larks. The range, a vast expanse of gray-green that grew greener as it stretched westward, undulated in rolling ridges and hollows like waves crashing into the dark, low hills that notched the blue horizon line. Before me stood 3 magnificent horses, saddled and ready for the day ahead. Their sleek coats glistened in the morning light, and their muscular bodies exuded an air of strength and grace. It was a sight that would have pleased any horse lover. As I took it all in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment wash over me. Life was good, and I was grateful for the opportunity to be a part of it. As I waited for the young ladies to arrive for their morning ride, I couldn't help but reflect on my recent experiences. In the past, I had thought I had reasons to ponder, but now I scoffed at those moments as trivial compared to what I had been through recently. It was one of those moments where I felt like an outsider looking in, skeptically observing the cowboy persona I had adopted. My attire was the epitome of a flashy cowboy, complete with a large sombrero adorned with a silver band, a red silk scarf, a black velvet shirt popular with the Indians, an embroidered buckskin vest, corduroy pants, fringed chaps with silver buttons, and a big blue gun hanging low at my side. My boots had high heels, and my spurs boasted silver rowels. Foster, my companion, had once claimed that I was a natural actor, but I never admitted that without my infatuation for Gwen, I would never have been able to pull off this act, not even to save the Ranger Service or the entire state of Texas. The most challenging part wasn't establishing a reputation. It was dealing with the scorn of cowboys, the ridicule of gamblers, and the teasing of the young men in the town. I had earned their respect through my quick wit and ability to fight with my fists and my gun. Despite the constant influx of strangers in Linrock, I relished spending time in hotels and resorts, pretending to have a weakness for drinking, gambling, and lounging, all while making friends with the rough crowd. I was a cool, calculating machine, always observing and registering everything around me. The hardest part of my charade was the lie I lived in the eyes of Diane Barkley and Gwen Langdon. Despite winning the sincere regard of my employer, I couldn't help feeling guilty for deceiving the 2 women who had captured my heart. People around town, including her father, Cousin Reuben, and other new acquaintances, had come to her with tales of my reckless behavior, urging for my dismissal. However, she refused to let me go and pleaded with me to mend my ways. Despite believing the rumors about me, she had faith in me and saw past my facade. I had fallen deeply in love with Gwen, who was indifferent towards me at times, cold at others, friendly like a comrade, and dangerously sweet. Somehow she saw through me and knew I wasn't who I pretended to be, but she never spoke her conviction. Instead, she championed me. I wanted to confess the truth about myself to her, thinking that it was the only way to win her over. However, she had never expressed any romantic feelings towards me, despite the way she looked at me. Despite this personal turmoil, I remained loyal to Vaughn Foster and committed to our work. It had been a busy month as we laid the foundation for our mission. My vigilance and stealthy efforts had yet to yield any evidence against Barkley, who was often absent from the home and hard to keep an eye on when he was there. Reuben Darling, who was involved in stock deals with Barkley and other men, had earned my contempt due to his heavy drinking, cruelty towards horses, and his tendency to cheat in gambling. He had also fallen in love with Diane Barkley and followed her around like a shadow when at home. The man despised me. He treated me like dirt beneath his feet, and if he ever had to speak to me, he did so with a harshness usually reserved for dogs. Every time I caught sight of his handsome face with its dark, half-closed eyes, I felt a hot, thick anger boiling up inside me. Foster and I spent a lot of time discussing the character and actions of Reuben Darling, who was Barkley's partner and the leader of a group of wealthy Linrock ranchers. We decided to bide our time before investigating their business practices too thoroughly. After all, this was a waiting game. From the start, it seemed that Linrock was none too pleased with Vaughn Foster's presence. But I suspected that there were some men in Linrock who secretly welcomed the Ranger's arrival. Everyone was speculating about what he was going to do, and his fame had preceded him. His mere presence had more of an impact on the wild Linrock element than an entire company of militia could have had. 1,000 stories circulated about him, most of which were false. Some said he was lightning fast on the draw and that it was certain death to face him. Others claimed he had killed 30 men, which was the wildest rumor of all. He was said to possess the gun skill of Buck Duane, the cunning of Cheseldine, and the devilry of King Fisher, the most notorious of Texas desperadoes. His nerve and lack of fear set him apart even among a horde of bold men. At first, the vicious element with which I had begun to affiliate myself was all conjecture and no action, for fear of alerting the sharp-eyed ranger. During his first few days in Linrock, Foster wasn't often seen in town, but he didn't hide either. People in bars and lounges were curious about him, wondering who he was after, what he would do first, and who would draw on him first. Some even speculated about when he would be found full of lead. As time went by, those who I needed to cultivate grew more curious and impatient. When it was leaked that Foster was trying to gather honest citizens to fight against the other element, Linrock showed its wolf teeth. People shot at Foster in the dark a few times, and he was slightly injured once. Rumors spread that Jack Blome, the local gunman, was coming to meet Foster. Linrock became divided, with some people becoming more secluded and others becoming rowdier. Strangers came and went, and a lot of money circulated. Vague rumors of rustlers, holdups, robberies, and murders crept in from other places, but neither Foster nor I could associate any of it with a possible gang of rustlers in Linrock. Despite this, we weren't discouraged. After 3 weeks, we became aware of activity around us, and we believed we would soon be on its track. My task was busy but easy, while Foster had to be careful for his life. I always reminded him of this. As I pondered on the possibilities of the month ahead, Miss Barkley and Gwen interrupted my thoughts. My employer appeared distressed while Gwen wore her cowgirl riding costume, accentuating her curvy figure and her daring, sparkling eyes. "Good morning, Tim," Miss Barkley greeted me, scrutinizing my face. I knew I was in for a lecture, so I put on a bold, innocent front. "Did you break your promise to me?" she asked, her voice laced with disappointment. "Which one?" I retorted, more concerned about Gwen's gaze on me than Miss Barkley's reproach. "About getting drunk again," Miss Barkley replied. "I didn't break that one." "My cousin Reuben saw you in the Hope So gambling place last night, drunk, staggering, mixing with that riffraff on the verge of a brawl," she continued. "Miss Barkley, with all due respect to Mr. Darling, I want to say that he has a strange wish to lower me in the eyes of you ladies," I protested, trying to sound spirited. "Tim, were you drunk?" she demanded. "No, I should think you needn't ask me that. Didn't you ever see a man the morning after a carouse?" Apparently she had seen such a sight before, and I stood before them, fresh, clean-shaven, and clear-eyed. Even Gwen's saucy face grew pensive. The only thing she ever asked of me was not to drink, as the Barkley family had a hard time with the habit. "Tim, you look just as nice as I'd want you to," Miss Barkley said, her tone uncertain. "I don't know what to think. They tell me things, you deny. Whom shall I believe? Reuben swore he saw you." "Miss Barkley, did I ever lie to you?" I asked. "Not to my knowledge," she replied. I looked at her, and she understood what I meant. "Reuben has lied to me, that day at Sanderson, and since too, I fear." "Miss Barkley, are you calling him a liar?" I asked, trying to diffuse the tension. Gwen moved closer, holding the bridle rein of her horse. "Tim, Cousin Reuben isn't the only one who saw you. Bert Waters told me the same thing," Gwen said nervously. It seemed like she wanted to believe me, but wasn't sure. "Waters! So he talks behind my back. I won't say anything about him, but do you really believe I was drunk?" I asked, feeling frustrated. "I'm afraid I do, Tim," Miss Barkley replied reluctantly. Was she testing me? "Look, Miss Barkley," I burst out, "why don't you just let me go? I'm not claiming to be a saint, but you don't believe me at all. I'm pretty bad, I'll admit that. I've done my fair share of gambling and fighting, but I did keep my promise to you. Now discharge me so I can call on Mr. Bert Waters." Miss Barkley looked alarmed, and Gwen turned pale. They both seemed to think I was a dangerous cowboy who was only being held back by their kindness. "No, please don't go," Gwen pleaded. "Diane, don't let him go." "Tim, please don't get angry," Miss Barkley said, putting a soft hand on my arm. It thrilled me, but also made me feel like a villain. "I won't discharge you. I need you, and so does Gwen. After all, what you do outside of here is none of my business. Didn't you ever have a sister, Tim?" I stayed silent, not wanting to lie again, but the situation was too good to pass up. "Miss Barkley," I started hesitantly, "I've made mistakes in the past, but I've been trying my best to be good here and make you happy. Recently I've been going down a bad path, not drunk but heading that way. Who knows what I'll do soon if my problem isn't fixed. "Tim, what's wrong?" asked my friend Gwen. "You know what's going on with me," I replied hastily. "Anyone could see it." Gwen blushed furiously. Miss Barkley looked at me with understanding. "I've fallen in love with Miss Gwen. I'm crazy about her. It's killing me to see these guys flirting with her," I confessed. "If you're crazy about me, you don't have to say it," Gwen exclaimed, her face turning red and white. "I want to stop your flirting one way or another. I've been serious. I wasn't flirting. I begged you to—" "You never did," interrupted Gwen furiously. That hint had been a spark. "I couldn't have dreamed it," I protested, wanting to be serious but also feeling amused. "That day when I didn't ask—" "If I remember correctly, you didn't ask anything," she replied, anger and sarcasm mixing with amusement. "But Gwen, I meant to. You understood me? Say you didn't believe I could take that liberty without honorable intentions." Gwen couldn't handle it and quickly mounted her horse, taking off like a bolt. "Stop me if you can," she called back with a mischievous grin. "Tim, go after her," said Miss Barkley. "In that mood she'll ride to Sanderson. My dear fellow, don't stare so. I understand many things now. Gwen is a flirt. She would drive any man mad. Tim, I've grown to like you a lot in a short time. If you give up drinking and gambling, maybe you'll have a chance with her. Hurry now, go after her." I quickly mounted my horse and spurred it to catch up with Gwen's. She rode out in the open, giving her horse free rein. Even if I had wanted to catch up with her, it would have been nearly impossible within the first 5 miles. Gwen had one of the fastest horses on the range, and she rode like a pro. Every now and then she looked back over her shoulder, noticing that I was gaining on her. Gwen was a lover of horses, races, and winning. I had the good fortune of riding with her alone more than once. Miss Barkley enjoyed riding as well, but she was not as daring as Gwen. Whenever she joined us, there was never a race. Whenever Gwen and I were out on our own, she always made me ride to keep up with her, or else I would lose her in the horizon. This morning I wanted her to experience complete freedom and to feel that I could not catch her even if I tried. Maybe my declaration to Miss Barkley had unleashed my strongest emotions. Whatever the reason, this ride was like no other, with the sky so blue, the scenery so vast and enchanting, and the wind so sweet. It felt as though the breeze was carrying the fragrance of Gwen Langdon's hair. I rode on like I had never ridden before. Horses grazed and whinnied as I passed by, jackrabbits hopped and hid in the tall grass, and a wolf slinked away from a herd of cattle nearby. Far in the distance, the low dark lines of mountains rose to the west, always seeming to hold a mysterious secret that I needed to uncover. The ride was strange because I couldn't shake the haunting feeling that my business on the frontier was deadly. It was in such contrast to the dreamy and futile longings that consumed my thoughts. At any moment I could be revealed as a ranger, and my disguise would be stripped away. Gwen led the way across the wide plain and up to the top of a ridge, where she waited for me, tired but victorious. I took my time reaching the summit, wondering how Gwen would receive me after my embarrassing display in front of her cousin. I had no reason to be hopeful, but to my surprise she greeted me in her sweetest mood, with a hint of shyness I had never seen before. "Tim, I gave you a run for your money that time," she said. 10 miles and you never caught me." "But you had a head start. I've had my fair share of trouble trying to beat you on an even playing field," I replied, knowing that Gwen was susceptible to flattery when it came to her riding skills. "In a longer race I was afraid you'd beat me. Tim, I've learned to ride out here. Back home I never had the space to ride a horse. Just look at this. Miles and miles of level green land. Little hills with black bunches of trees, not a soul in sight. Even the town is hidden in the green. It's all wild and lonely. Isn't it glorious, Tim?" "Lately it's been getting to me," I replied solemnly. Gwen and I gazed out over the sea of gray-green, taking in the undulating waves of the ground in the distance. These rides had taught me to appreciate the beauty of the lonely plains. But when I looked at Gwen, I couldn't help but focus on her. The scenery could wait. As I gazed upon her, I attempted to discern that unique quality that set her apart from others. But it evaded me. With a rose in her cheeks, hair blowing in the wind, and her eyes now serious instead of teasing, she only appeared more beautiful than usual. I dismounted from my horse, ostensibly to tighten the saddle girths on hers, but I took my time with the task. When she looked down at me, I sensed a subtle shift in her demeanor, a softness and dangerous sweetness that rarely manifested. mingled with a deeper sense of character and womanhood that I had never before perceived in her. "Tim, it wasn't nice to tell Diane that," she spoke, breaking the silence. "Nice? It was, oh, I'd like to swear," I exclaimed, realizing the source of my miserable feelings. "But now I understand. I was jealous, Gwen. I'm sorry. I apologize." Gwen removed her gloves, and her hand, small and shapely, rested on her knee near me. I took it in mine, and she allowed it, though she averted her gaze, the color in her cheeks deepening. "I can forgive that," she murmured. "But the lie. Jealousy doesn't excuse a lie." "You mean what I suggested to your cousin?" I clarified, attempting to meet her gaze. "That was the devil in me, but it's true." "How can it be true when you never said a word about it?" she challenged. "Diane believed what you said. I know she thinks me horrid." "No, she doesn't. And as for what I said or meant to say, which is essentially the same thing, how did you interpret my actions? I hope not in the same way as you interpret Darling's or the other fellows." Gwen fell silent, her complexion now a little pallid, and I discerned that I didn't need to mention the other fellows any further. The change in her was palpable, and it spurred me to give in to the fervent and ardent side of myself entirely. "Gwen, I love you. My actions may have confused you, but let me clarify. I was consumed by both love and jealousy. Will you marry me?" Gwen remained silent, but her stubborn nature was nowhere to be seen. I slowly pulled her towards me, a gesture she could have easily resisted, yet she slipped from her horse and into my arms. In that moment I felt the sweet certainty of her kissing me of her own volition. She was bashful yet yielding, allowing herself to be held but not completely undone. Perhaps I was too rough, for she cried out and pleaded for me to release her. I obliged, but not entirely. "Gwen, you still haven't given me an answer," I pleaded tenderly. "Do you love me?" "I think so," she whispered. "Gwen, will you marry me?" She disengaged herself from me and sat up straight, her chest heaving. "No, Tim," she finally said, regaining her composure. "But if I love you, why won't I marry you?" I interrupted, but her expression silenced me. "I can't just promise to marry you. I don't even know your last name. You're not a reliable man. You drink, gamble, and fight. You'll end up killing someone, and then I won't love you anymore. Besides, there's something about you that I can't trust." I could feel my face darken, and my hope and happiness quickly dissipated. But before I could say anything, Gwen placed a kind hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry if I hurt you, but I had to tell you why I couldn't be engaged to you. I know your intentions are genuine, but I just can't trust you. You're not good enough for me." "I had no right to ask you to marry me," I said humbly. "Gwen, please don't think I'm too proud," she hesitated. "I wouldn't care who you were if only I could respect you. Some things about you are amazing. You're such a man, that's why I care. But you gamble, you drink, and I hate that. They say you're dangerous, and I am constantly afraid you'll hurt someone. Remember, Tim, I'm not from Texas." This regret from Gwen, this faltering distress in causing me pain, was such a sweet assurance that she loved me more than she knew, that I was divided between extremes of emotion. "Will you wait? Will you give me a chance? After all, maybe I'm not as bad as I seem." "Oh, if only you weren't. Tim, are you asking me to trust you? I beg you, dearest, trust me and wait." "Wait? What for? Are you really honest, Tim? Or are you what Reuben calls you, a drunken cowboy, a gambler, sharp with the cards, a gunfighter?" My face grew cold as I felt the blood drain from it. At that moment, the mention of Reuben Darling fixed my hatred for him once and for all. It was bitter indeed that I could not give him a lie, but what could I do? The character Darling gave me was scarcely worse than what I had chosen to represent. I had to acknowledge the justice of his claim, but I still hated him. "Gwen, I ask you to trust me despite my reputation." "You're asking me a lot," she replied. "Yes, it's too much. Let it be then only this, you'll wait. And while you wait, promise not to flirt with Darling and Waters." "Tim, I won't let Reuben or any of them so much as dare touch me," she declared in girlish earnestness, her voice rising. "I'll make a deal with you," Gwen said, her voice soft and pleading. "If you promise not to go into those saloons any more, I promise to do the same." Her words tugged at my heartstrings. I couldn't resist the way her face lit up with hope, her eyes glistening with tears. But I couldn't give in. My mission in Linrock was too important. I couldn't let Gwen's charm distract me from the dark nature of my work. I wanted to tell her everything, to spill the truth, but it wasn't my secret to share, so I kept my promise and stayed silent. Gwen's expression shifted from hopeful to disappointed. I could see the hurt in her eyes, and it made my heart ache. But then she turned her scorn on me, and I couldn't help feeling angry. "That's too much to promise all at once," I protested lamely, knowing my words were weak. "Tim, a promise like that is nothing if a man loves a girl," Gwen retorted. "Don't make any more love to me, please, unless you want me to laugh at you. And don't feel such terrible trouble if you happen to see me flirting occasionally." Her mocking laughter stung, and I felt a surge of bitterness rise in my throat. "All right, I'll take my medicine," I replied bitterly. "I'll certainly never make love to you again, and I'll stand it if I happen to see Waters kiss you or any other decent fellow. But look out how you let that damned backbiter darling fool around you." My words came out in a quick, fierce torrent, my eyes locked onto hers. Gwen paled at my intensity, and for a moment I regretted my outburst. But then I remembered the dark purpose of my mission, and my resolve hardened. I couldn't let myself be swayed by Gwen's charm, no matter how much it tore at my heart. My subtle insinuation failed to quell her fury. She flipped her head and galloped away. I trailed a short distance behind her as we made our way back to the ranch, a 10-mile journey. Once we arrived at the corrals, she dismounted and handed her horse over to Dick. Without so much as a nod or goodbye, she headed towards the house. I, too, was in no mood for pleasantries and decided to head into town. However, upon turning onto the main street, I was immediately distracted by a commotion outside the town hall. The noise and excitement seemed to be connected to Barkley, the mayor of Linrock, who held court in the hall once a month. I had to push my way through the crowd to get inside. Once I was in, I saw that most of the crowd was outside, not interested in entering. Foster, Barkley, and Darling were all present, along with a dozen or so other men, all shouting excitedly. I moved closer to the front, but didn't bother trying to hear what was being said. Barkley sat at a table on a platform alongside Hanford Owens, the county judge, and Gorsuch, one of his sheriffs. There were also several other familiar faces and a few strangers, all dusty horsemen. Foster stood apart from the group, his hair messy and his shirt unbuttoned. He looked calm and tough. When our eyes met, I knew that the moment we had been waiting for had finally arrived. Barkley banged on the table to get everyone's attention. Despite being the mayor, he struggled to settle the commotion. Eventually, things quieted down, and I overheard that Foster had interrupted a meeting in the hall. "Foster, what are you doing here?" Barkley demanded. "Isn't this a court? Aren't you the mayor of Linrock?" Foster replied in a loud and clear voice, making it evident that he wanted everyone outside to hear. "Yes," Barkley answered, appearing as hard as flint. However, I could sense his keen interest in what Foster had to say. I knew then that Foster's intention was to make Barkley stand out before the crowd as either the real mayor of Linrock or as a man whose office was a sham. "I've arrested a criminal," Foster announced. "Bud Rasmussen. I charge him with assaulting Jim Dempsey and attempting robbery, if not murder. Rasmussen had a questionable past here, which the court will know if it keeps a record." I then noticed Rasmussen cowering on a bench, looking visibly shaken. He had been a regular at the gambling dens, the type of person I never trusted. Jim Dempsey, the restaurant owner, was also present, and upon closer inspection, I saw that he was pale and had blood on his face. I knew Jim. I liked him and had tried to befriend him. The last sentence of Foster's speech stung, and I knew I had correctly judged his motive. I began to get excited about the situation. "What's the word on the street, Bud? Speak up for yourself," barked Barkley. Rasmussen stood up, glancing nervously at Foster, and shuffled forward a few steps towards the mayor. He had a sinister appearance, but lacked the courage of a rustler. "It's not true, Barkley," he began in a loud voice. "I went to Dempsey's for food. Some stranger I've never seen before came in from the hall and attacked him, wrestling him to the ground. Then this big ranger came and arrested me. I didn't do anything. This ranger just wants to arrest someone. That's what I reckon, Barkley." "What do you have to say about this, Dempsey?" Barkley asked sharply. "I remind you that you once lied in court and were punished for it." Why did I sense a hint of threat or danger in Barkley's reminder? Dempsey got up from the bench and used his unsteady hand to support himself. He was no longer young and seemed to be broken in health and spirit. He had a head injury. "I don't have much to say," he replied. "The ranger brought me here. I told him I didn't take my problems to court. Besides, I can't swear it was Rasmussen who hit me." Barkley whispered something to Judge Owens, and the judge nodded his bushy head. "Bud, you're free to go," Barkley said bluntly. "The rest of you get out of here." He completely ignored the ranger. This was his way of rejecting Foster's advances and rebuffing the interfering ranger service. If Barkley was corrupt, he had a lot of nerve. I almost thought he was above suspicion. However, his nonchalant attitude, his air of finality, his authoritative assurance, and the slight tension around his mouth and the slow paling of his olive skin were all telltale signs to my experienced eyes. He had crossed paths with Vaughn Foster, a famous Texas ranger, and had blocked his way. The man seemed to understand the gravity of what he had done. I studied Barkley and noticed his intense curiosity. Suddenly, Bud Rasmussen coughed and took a couple of steps towards the door. Foster called out, "Hold on!" It was like a bugle call, stopping Rasmussen in his tracks. Foster accused Rasmussen of attacking Dempsey, and Barkley was forced to confront the Ranger Service's idea of law. He didn't hesitate and declared that they wouldn't aid or abet or accept any ranger service west of the Pecos. Foster called him out on his lie and produced letters from Linrock citizens begging for ranger service. Barkley was at a loss for words. Foster demanded Barkley's help, and when he refused, he declared that he would work alone and take Rasmussen to Del Rio in irons. Reuben Darling, who had no apparent reason to be angry, rushed up to the table and cursed Barkley. Barkley shoved him back and demanded to see Foster's warrant. Foster replied that he didn't need one to make an arrest and that Barkley was ignorant of the power of Texas Rangers. Barkley bellowed that they couldn't take Rasmussen without papers. Foster responded to Barkley's threat with a confident, "He won't. You won't be able to pull any of your ranger tricks out here. I'll make sure of it." Barkley's passionate response seemed to be what Foster was waiting for. He wanted to force Barkley's hand and make his stance clear to the town. Foster stepped back from the crowd, and in a swift motion his guns were drawn. It was like watching a transformation. Foster, the ranger, was ready for a showdown. I was thrilled to see him in action. I couldn't wait to join in. "Folks, listen up," Foster shouted. "I need your help to arrest this criminal who is being protected by Barkley, the mayor of Linrock. This will be reported to the Adjutant General in Austin. Barkley, don't try anything stupid." Barkley sat there, fuming with anger. Foster then called out to Rasmussen, ordering him to come forward. Rasmussen, looking nervous, obeyed. Foster took out a pair of handcuffs from his pocket and handed them to Gorsuch. "Put these on Rasmussen," he commanded. Rasmussen was then escorted to stand next to Foster. I was amazed at how quickly Foster's commands were followed.